Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm Jim Van Epps, Chair of the Savannah Council's Program Committee, and host for this evening's presentation by Ms. Margaret Coker, entitled Spies and Allies: How Lessons from the War on Terror Can Influence the Fight Against Extremism at Home. Fascinating topic, particularly at this time. First, I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors of this evening's presentation. Kreitz Auto Group, you've seen before, and that's because Kreitz is a platinum sponsor of the Savannah Council for 20 and 21. Kreitz is our exclusive local dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Sprinter vans. Kreitz is a continuing sponsor this year, and we appreciate their support of our programs. Thank you, Kreitz. Our sponsors this evening also include Chatham Parkway Lexus, which is proud to be a sponsor of the Savannah Council. As a recipient of the Savannah Morning News Best of the Best for Best New Car Dealer, Best Used Car Dealer, Best Dealership Service Department, and Best Dealership Salesperson for the second consecutive year, Chatham Parkway Lexus is dedicated to support our wonderful community, and thank you, Chatham Parkway Lexus. Also, as you can see, Reach the World is our sponsor, and for over 20 years, Reach the World has harnessed the power of virtual exchange, inspiring students to become serious, confident, and compassionate global citizens. For the 2021 school year, the organization is offering free and paid opportunities for teachers, students, and their families to connect with travelers exploring the world in real time. Thank you, Reach the World. And our presenter this evening is Miss Margaret Coker. She is a prize-winning journalist who now lives in Savannah, one of our own. She grew up in a military family where both her parents and her uncles all served in the United States Armed Forces. When the September 11th attacks occurred, her newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, sent her to Pakistan and Afghanistan, and then throughout the Middle East to cover what we now call the War on Terror. For the last 20 years, she has lived and worked in 32 countries on 4 continents. Since the invasion of Iraq, her work is largely focused on the Middle East, writing about corruption, counterterrorism, and cyber warfare. In 2008, she went to work for the Wall Street Journal. Her stories, written during the Arab Spring in Libya, won prizes for investigative journalism and diplomatic reporting. And in 2016, she led a team whose investigative journalism was cited as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in international reporting. In 2017, she joined the New York Times as the Baghdad bureau chief, where her front page stories about intelligence and counterterrorism won numerous prizes as well. She returned to Savannah in 2019 to write her first book, The Spy Master of Baghdad, a true story of bravery, family, and patriotism in the battle against ISIS. Interesting, and I'm in the middle of it. We'll hear more from her about it this evening. Ms. Coker is now the editor-in-chief of The Current, a nonprofit investigative news organization. That started operations, I should say, in Savannah last year, and she and her team are reviving serious public service journalism for our hometown and across coastal Georgia. Now to her topic, Spies and Allies: How Lessons from the War on Terror Can Influence the Fight Against Extremism at Home. As mentioned since 9/11, she has reported from the front lines of the United States war on terror. Her recent book, The Spy Master of Baghdad, tells the real-life tale of one of the most secretive and elite counterterrorism groups in the world. You will find it fascinating. Ms. Coker will discuss how time-honored intelligence techniques used to destroy Al-Qaeda and Islamic State terror networks can be used to combat what the Department of Homeland Security, my apologies, says is now the most dangerous threat to America: violent white supremacy organizations. Following her presentation, Margaret will take questions from our viewers that can be easily done via the Zoom Q&A function on either your laptop or your iPad. And just click on the Q&A icon on your screen, type in your question, click send, we'll get it. The sooner you get us your questions, the better chance of getting those questions asked and answered before our ending at 8 o'clock. And now it's a pleasure to present Margaret Coker. It's a great honor to have you with us this evening, even in this virtual fashion.
Thank you, and thank everyone for agreeing to spend an hour or so with me this evening. I am grateful for your time and your enthusiasm about this really important national security topic. I am going to hopefully give you my screen here so everyone can see my PowerPoint presentation. I want to just say thank you to Jim for that excellent introduction. I will add a couple more words about myself so you can understand why a Air Force Marine brat like me is getting into the business of spies and allies. As Jim said, all the men in my family, plus my mother, were served in the U.S. Armed Forces. We were the kind of family who watched World War II movies every Saturday afternoon. We were the kind of family who went to famous battlefields. And so as I grew up, I was deeply interested in, as a Cold War baby, all of these spy novels that probably a lot of you have also read, whether it's John le Carré or James Bond or whomever. I was also really deeply fascinated in the history of the Great Wars and the tales of the allies that we had during those times, right? We all probably are aware of, if you watch the movie Casablanca, you know, the partisans who were trying to work with us secretly while they were living in enemy territory, whether they were Polish or French or German or even, you know, our old Russian allies. You know, those names and those stories are more familiar to us than our modern wars. And as I grew up and started becoming a journalist and then covering the war on terror, the notion to me that this long forever war, the longest war that our country has ever fought, the stories about the allies who are helping us in faraway lands with hard to pronounce names in places that we perhaps have never been to, you know, their tales are important, just like our allies in World War II were. So that was the background for me when I started conceiving and writing and researching my book, The Spy Master of Baghdad. But for tonight, I want to sort of take us back into time a little bit, just about national security and counterterrorism, counterintelligence policies in the US. You know, for so many years, throughout human history, in fact, the idea of getting good intelligence, both from your allies and your enemies, was incredibly important for winning wars. Sun Tzu, I have a quote here from him, because of course, the idea of trying to get real-time and quality accurate intelligence has always been a conundrum. And as Sun Tzu says in this quote, human intelligence is incredibly important. And how you find your human sources, you know, he gives an interesting recipe. You need to give them instructions and figure out what you can use and what you can trust. And that time-honored tactic has been used through the Middle Ages, both in Arab history, in classical Greek and Roman history, obviously, and much further on in the 20th century, in the Cold War. It was the classic way in which we would get intelligence from back and forth behind the Iron Curtain. But then suddenly, when 9/11 happened, our world shifted quite dramatically. It turned out that, in fact, our national security and intelligence agencies here in the US had no idea who this enemy was that attacked us on our homeland. It turned out that as US forces went to occupy foreign lands, Afghanistan, and then Iraq, we really had no idea about the culture, the language, an unknown agency or unknown group, but we didn't have eyes inside. We didn't have human intelligence. And the man who took credit for the 9/11 attacks, Osama bin Laden, as we all know, it took years and years and years for us to track him down, find him, and finally kill him. We did that despite the fact with this trillion-dollar new national security infrastructure put in place after 9/11 that was high tech forward. It was a surveillance state with enormous amounts of hardware, machine learning, algorithms, and satellites at our disposal. It actually took a human agent in the mountainous region of Pakistan in order to confirm where bin Laden was, so that our special forces could go into the compound, find him, and kill him. It's a pretty stark example of how human intelligence, despite the amounts of money we spend on surveillance and high-tech equipment, is really quite useful in the modern age. Here's a lovely picture of Baghdad. It's one that most people don't see. You know, for all of the memoirs and all of the histories that have been written since 2003, when we toppled Saddam Hussein and tried to help rebuild Iraq, we don't see Iraq like this peaceful green oasis. This is downtown Baghdad from the balcony of the hotel that I would stay in when in the last 3 or 4 years, as I spent a lot of time in Iraq. You know, back to this sort of childhood love of history and learning about partisans and allies. When I went back to Iraq in 2017 for the New York Times, I was greeted with this as scenes of Baghdad every night from my balcony. For the capital that had been known as the murder capital of the world, the place where hundreds, if not thousands, of US forces lost their lives in sectarian violence and terrorism violence, and where tens of thousands of Iraqis also lost their lives in the mid-2000s. It was a place that was tranquil, that was undergoing a renaissance, and actually peaceful. And the crux of the book that I wrote, The Spy Master of Baghdad, it is about this elite group of partisans, an elite group of counterterrorism officials who have been able to crack the nut of Al-Qaeda's terror networks in Iraq, and then the Islamic State networks in Iraq as well. My story sort of will drive through the past 15 years and give you a better idea in a lot of detail about the ways in which our Iraqi partners had to prove themselves to the Americans, how the Americans had to find which Iraqis to trust, and then also tell you about some of the once classified terror operations that they helped the Americans to succeed in. I'm not going to go deep into that right now, but I just want to give you a flavor of how important it is to find allies when we have a global war on, and then to give credit to the people who suit up every day in defense of their own nation, and whose agendas and whose values and whose goals align with ours. So the silent allies, these Arabs, these Iraqis, these Afghans, Libyans, I mean, people from across the Middle East have actually been quite active in fighting the war on terror with us. And the men and women who live in the countries that are in peril from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda before it, they are the ones who know best how to find out who are your real enemies versus who might just be related to a bad guy. And they are the people, because they know the language and the tribal structures and the ways in which families are related and interconnected. They can actually recruit double agents to go behind enemy lines and fight the battles that we need fought, not the military battles, but the ones that involve intelligence and that shadowy war to get rid of the bad guys. My spies, this elite Iraqi unit, they're called the Falcons. And their ability to recruit double agents were incredibly important. It's actually the underpinning of how we all in the global coalition against the Islamic State, we were able to find Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the self-proclaimed caliph of the Islamic State. When the ground battles in Iraq ended in 2017, he escaped. The Islamic State that he once reigned over was in tatters, but he and his inner circle escaped northern Iraq and spent almost a year, out of reach as they were hiding underground in different parts of Syria. My spies, the Falcons, this Iraqi elite unit, they had a long-time double agent in al-Baghdadi's inner circle. It was a masterful stroke of wartime espionage. And this double agent, who was an Iraqi national, he had made this deal with my spy master of Baghdad that the spy master would make sure his family was safe, would be relocated out of Iraq, out of the war zone, and they would be able to live productive, financially secure lives if he would give up al-Baghdadi's location. He did. And in October 2019, al-Baghdadi was killed with U.S. Special Forces in a drone strike. Double agents and human intelligence, they are a gift that can keep on giving. If you create the right trustworthy relationships, you can not only knock off one master terrorist, sometimes you can knock off two. 3 months after al-Baghdadi was assassinated in Syria, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, General Qasem al-Soleimani, he was also assassinated in Iraq, in Baghdad, thanks to other Iraqi allies, men and sometimes women whose names we'll never know. But if you read my book, The Spy Master of Baghdad, you'll learn more about them. So it's an interesting thing that I'm a very strong American patriot, that I've spent 20 years of my professional life overseas. And as I've been chronicling the first draft of history on the war on terror, we've all watched, I think, quite alarmingly, how domestic terror here at home has been on the rise. This photo behind my slide is a picture of the Alfred E. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. One of the place where my father's last command was before he retired from the military was the Air Force Base in the south of Oklahoma City. And my family was living there in 1995 when Timothy McVeigh put together his fertilizer bomb and destroyed the federal building, killing 168 people, all Americans. So the idea of domestic terrorism is something that I've lived with in the back of my mind and as a part of my family's history, again, for years and years. However, the faces of domestic terrorism, I think these people are probably all familiar to you. The Unabomber, right? Ted Kaczynski, Timothy McVeigh, who I just mentioned, Dylan Roof, who much more recently killed the Black worshippers in North Charleston. This is what is in the forefront of my mind when I think of domestic terror. But for so long, after 9/11, of course, both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, they rated homegrown terrorism as American Muslims, or maybe foreign Muslims who had come to live in the U.S., thinking that those enemies, they must be enemies on our midst because they're foreign, they have swarthy skin, they have a different religion, and they're this unknown X factor. But guess what? As you can see from the slide here, I mean, this isn't a partisan statistic. This is just cold, hard facts. U.S. terrorism-related cases year by year have decreased significantly from over the last 5 years alone. The threat that is assessed by both the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and other law enforcement is no longer Muslim communities, whether they're Arab American, Bangladeshi American, Somali American. It's not that there aren't individuals who still need to be on a terror watch list. It's that as a community wide, the threat is less and less. And there are lots of reasons why that's the case. One is that, just because you're Muslim doesn't mean you're a terrorist. But as well, law enforcement has remembered after sort of losing the plot and losing this time-honored tactic after 9/11 that human intelligence, human agents are incredibly vital to fighting counterintelligence and counterterrorism battles. In fact, counterterrorism officials will now tell you that the best tips come from the Muslim American communities over the last 15 years. There are plots that can be disrupted because people who live in the communities where extremists are raised and know their neighbors. They want to turn them in because, as all Americans, we would like peace, quiet, and law and order. So we move forward, right? In 2018, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security will tell you that the biggest terror threat to our homeland come from white supremacist groups. In fact, like Timothy McVeigh back in 1995, white supremacist groups have been responsible for more deaths than any other domestic extremist group over the last 3 years. And in 2019, the Department of Homeland Security put specific white supremacist groups on its list of domestic terror threats. And that's a problem, isn't it? When people like you and have been raised in the same churches as you, it's harder to figure out who's a threat and who isn't. So after 15 years of a really strong pendulum shift, after 9/11, again, as I've mentioned, the rise of the national surveillance state and the national security state has been incredibly dependent on high technology and satellites and aerial drones and aerial surveillance and huge mega computers that are both monitoring our phone calls and accessing and analyzing data that in volumes that it's very hard to comprehend. But as we get back to trying to figure out who's a real threat and not who's just a possible threat, FBI leaders, Homeland Security leaders, law enforcement leaders are figuring out again that human sources are vitally important to the successful prosecution and knowledge of where threats lie in America, especially when we're talking about white supremacist groups. So, sorry, I'm going to jump back here before we get to that slide. One small anecdote. When I was researching my book, again, it sort of focuses in on this elite Iraqi counterterrorism unit. And they are a band of brothers that started off about 15 people large. They're now about 80 and broken up into 3 different units doing specific intelligence tasks. While I was doing my research in 2019, a couple of the crack intelligence agents, they were invited to Washington, D.C. to the FBI to go through a summer-long training with FBI officers. And it was really interesting because for all the time that I spent with these Iraqis who I profile in my book, all the time that we spent together in Iraq over the last several years, it was the first time that I was able to see them in America and in Washington, D.C. And so I thought it was a really telling, sort of mark in both our own national intelligence history when the Iraqis who were brought over to learn something from the FBI, it turned out after about 2 weeks of training that the FBI officers started coming to class and sitting in the seats and letting the Iraqis teach them a few things. Again, this amazing talent of being able to recruit human intelligence is something that was sort of lost after 9/11, and it's being relearned again. Why is it important? Well, anyone who's watching the news or who watched the news on January 6th and is listening to the news this week understands why it's important. We had a angry, violent, and some armed mob attack our Capitol building on January 6th. Lots of people were at the Capitol that day, but some people were there intent on doing harm, both physical harm and maybe bodily harm. I don't want this to get bogged down into partisan politics, but from a sure, national security point of view, FBI Director Christopher Wray told the Senate Judiciary Committee back in March that he absolutely wished the agency had penetrated the groups who were there to do bodily harm that day. He talked about how it's incredibly important to find better information and better analysis of who the groups are and what their motivations are. There's a large question at play here about whether the FBI does have eyes and ears inside of these groups that they have already named as terrorist organizations. That includes the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. And if there are informants, how is it that our national security apparatus did not know about January 6th ahead of time? Big issues that are now being worked out, both on from the Department of Justice and perhaps in Congress itself over the next couple of months. If there's any questions that remain about whether human informants generate results as opposed to phone taps, as opposed to satellite surveillance, as opposed to any other high-tech method, the fact is that I think the arrests after January 6th sort of speak for themselves. At least 18 Proud Boy members have been arrested since the riots. They've been charged on a variety of federal violent charges, from conspiracy to assault. Prosecutors are using plea bargains now, of course, to learn more about the organization of the insurrection. And that is a great tool to try to convict people who were there and threatened our democracy and threatened to do harm to our lawmakers. But intelligence is supposed to stop things before violent attacks happen. And even though prosecutors are in a great position to get convictions now, the real big national security question remains: how can the FBI and Homeland Security stop the next violent attack? And the way that my Iraqi spies, who have helped bring down terrorist kingpins over the last 5 and 6 years, along with their American partners, the very simple answer is what they'll tell you is that you need better human intelligence and you need better human agents. We go back to Sun Tzu, the original intelligence academic, right? It's essential to seek out your enemy agents. It's essential to turn them. It's essential to give them instructions, find out what you need, and you will keep your homeland safe. So simple, but very hard to do. I have, that's the end of my slides. And there's a lot of big questions here, and big, probably lots of ground to cover. So Jim, I'm going to stop my screen sharing, and maybe we can open it for questions.
Sure enough. Thank you. Thank you so much, Margaret. And it was an excellent presentation that I've got several questions to start with, but it's also time for our viewers to jump in and ask you. So one of them that comes in that I'd like to start with is from Ann Fenstermacher, who is one of our members. And she says, do you know if the US, and this goes to your book, do you know if the US honored their agreements to protect and resettle the double agents? And what happened to the double agent? Can you tell us that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of sticky ethical questions to wrestle with as you write books about intelligence matters. I mean, one thing for certain is that I wanted to bring to life the inner lives, the family lives, the professional dilemmas and personal challenges that these Iraqi spies have every day, but also wanted to be able to give them credit where credit's due for some of these successful and very brave operations that they've been part of, and at the same time make sure that they all remain safe and able to do their jobs and not give away too many of the secrets. So the double agent that was within al-Baghdadi's inner circle, yes, I can tell you, his family was taken care of. They were repatriated. They are living a life under new assumed names. And in fact, as far as I know, as of a month and a half ago, when the last time I talked with the spy master of Baghdad, they were all safe. But their husband, their father, who was within al-Baghdadi's inner circle, he was actually killed in the raid that also killed Baghdadi. So he sacrificed his life, and his family, I think, are I mean, they're definitely safe and hopefully psychologically okay.
So that's who that was in the book. Yeah, I recall. Yeah. You didn't identify it at that point, but thank you. Yeah. And so I'd like to go to a point that came up 3 or 4 minutes ago, and as you can imagine or have been told, we are a neutral association, and we have no political leanings at all, and we try and keep our comments just that way. So I just thought I would toss that out. I should have said that to you earlier.
Well, I presume that, but in today's day and age, it can be challenging quite quickly.
Exactly. So I'd like one question. When you arrived in Baghdad, how and in Iraq in general, how difficult was it to sort out the different factions? And the reason I say that is, personally, I have been reading or studying since 1989, and I remember when I was in a certain school, and when I did that, and we got into discussions or readings, we could never understand who was whom and who was doing what for whom and so forth. It was complicated. I think we have come to have a better understanding, that we understand the Sunni and the Shia. However, what about the internal groups? How can you talk about that and how you came to learn that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I as a college student, I studied Russian. That was the language of the enemy back in the day. It's a gift that keeps on giving, I have to say. Over the last 20 years, it's never been a bad talent to have. But as after 9/11, and as I was moving to the Middle East for my newspaper, I started studying Arabic because it's really important to have. To understand the language and the culture that in which you're working. I can't I can't credit myself with fluency. I probably speak like an 8 or 9-year-old because my formal studies were cut short by the U.S. invasion in April 2003. However, I do have a pretty good ear for languages. So, it was part of the learning curve that the Americans had writ large, about who you can trust and who's an honest broker, and who has some talent sort of renew a nation that had been hollowed out inside under Saddam Hussein. As for ourselves, as journalists, you have you go out in search of sources from all walks of life, and pretty soon you can figure out who's lying to you and who's serving up bad intelligence, right? I mean, if someone sends you bad facts, it's your personal reputation on the line for that. So we have a pretty short tether when it comes to who you can trust and who you don't. I think the battleship known as U.S. government has a much harder time turning course when it comes to their valued partners in different parts of the world. But listen, I mean, Iraqis come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and their sectarian identity, whether it's a country that is probably 96% Muslim, two different major sects, Sunni and Shia. This was not part of the primary identity that many people would consider as they introduce themselves to you. They wanted to tell you what their professional credentials were, or where they grew up, what neighborhood in Baghdad. There's a lot of different ways in which that we all have to identify ourselves, whether it's our socioeconomic background, whether it's our academic status, whether it's the kind of books we like to read. And so Iraqis. The armed Iraqi militias that terrorized the country for the mid 2000s, that's when sectarianism became such an important factor. And ordinary Iraqis had to take that on as their primary identity in order to keep themselves alive. I would say that it becomes shorthand a lot of ways to try and say who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. It's a pretty facile way to be able to describe, the complexity of Iraqi society. But be that as it may, there are a variety of Shia parties, and it doesn't, if you're loyal to one party, you might get a job in government. It doesn't matter if you're a Shia. It only matters if you voted for that political party in the past election cycle. So it's a complex place. It has a lot of sophistication that other countries in the Middle East do not have, in part because over the last 15 years, I mean, we might be able to debate tonight whether we think the invasion in 2003 was warranted or not. But in the aftermath of that, the Iraqis have had 15 years of a democracy of sorts. They have completely refashioned their relationship with power structures, with authority. They demand results from government, and they continually vote the bastards out when they actually don't do what the people want them to do. And that you can hear Iraqis talk about politics and those sentiments up and down, north and south, no matter what ethnic group you come from. So there's reasons to be optimistic about the way in which Iraqi society is coalescing. And I don't want to minimize the bloodshed. The bloodshed and the trauma have been immense over the last 15 years. Yeah. One thing, though, about nation building is that out of trauma and bloodshed usually can come some positives, right? I mean, the whole entire nation united to defeat the Islamic State. It was something that everyone did together, and in a way in which there was a powerful price to pay for that nation building exercise, but they are a stronger nation now than they were 5 years ago, for sure.
Very, very interesting comment. I'd like to, when we can, I'd like to get back to that, but I'd like to, out of respect to our listeners and watchers, I'd like to go to a question from Olavi Aarons. Can you say anything about the motivation of the persons in Iraq? And you talked a little bit about this, but have been willing to become double agents. Are there personal reasons, patriotic reasons? What else might there be?
Yeah, well, I hope you'll read the book and learn more. But in a nutshell, I can say this: there's the terrorist groups that my spies have been fighting, right? I mean, it's been Al Qaeda, it's been the Islamic State. They are extremist religious organizations that have a very core ideology, but there's a lot of different reasons why, if you live in Iraq, you might join that terror group. It might be that you actually hate Americans. It might just be as simple as all the men in your family have joined, and there's no way in which you can't join because there's nowhere else for you to go. You can't move out of your father's house or your uncle's house and go to another city because that's just not done in Iraq. It might be that you have to join on paper because the Islamic State has taken over a third of the nation, and that includes your village, and you've got crops in the field and no money in which you can use to flee and become a refugee. So there's lots of very prosaic reasons why you might have a tie in terms of membership ranks. The spy master of Baghdad is a man named Abu Ali al-Basri, and he and his interrogators, they have been as people who have been trying to rebuild their country. What they also have been trying to do is rebuild professional ranks of intelligence officers. Instead of having to rely on torture, they actually want to rely on sort of common sense interrogations and common sense methods in order to build their networks of human agents. And so one of the very successful, it takes a lot of time, but one of the most successful ways of doing it is telling someone who you have captured or arrested, telling him, if you go back inside into the terror network, if you go back inside and deliver quality intelligence to us, we're going to release 3 of your brothers and 2 of your uncles that we know are arrested or captured in another part of the country, and we'll give them get out of jail free cards. There's a lot of family and family dynamics and psychological tools that you can use as an Iraqi that the Americans just aren't privy to because it's not our culture, to get people to work with you. In one case in my book, there is one of the couriers in the mid 2000s, one of the couriers who was going back and forth between the 2 leaders of Al Qaeda in Iraq. He was the man who was delivering instructions to terror networks inside Baghdad in order to set off bombs in the Iraqi capital. Well, that courier was turned by the Falcons, by this Iraqi unit, in large part because Abu Ali al-Basri got his mother on the phone And so here's a guy who's in a hospital bed because he was wounded in a gunfight, and Awali al-Basri wants him to do something that's really uncomfortable for him to do. But he got his mother on the phone. He put the phone up to the guy's ear, and so she berated him and said, "Look, for the good of all of us, you better do this." And it was kind of as simple as that. No need for beatings, no need for waterboarding. Get the mom on the phone and see what happens.
So I can't even imagine that those circumstances. Next question, though, from Sherry LeBlanc. How do we sort out the people, this is contemporary here, how do we sort out the people in our own political leadership who aided and supported the white supremacy group members of September 6th? Good luck. Good luck.
I think there's a simple answer, a straightforward answer that's not so simple. People, there are people who were elected to represent their constituencies and their districts, and the people have the power in America. We can vote the bastards out, and so it's kind of straightforward and as simple as that. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to recognize Sherry's question. So
it's a perfectly legitimate question, but if you are elected in a fair ballot, you're elected, and there are methods in different states to recall elected officials. I think if we all agree that elections were full of integrity and were done fairly, then that's the legal way to make that lawmaker lose their seat.
Okay, thank you. Good effort there. So the next question comes from my friend Ron Kranich, and his question is: can you share with us some of your experiences as a female reporter operating in this difficult arena that tends to be dominated, apparently, we perceive, by male reporters? So CNN's Clarissa Ward recently published a book on all fronts, The Education of a Journalist, in which she shares her challenges in some of the world's mean neighborhoods. Is your reporting experience similar to her experience? Thanks, Ron.
Yeah, I have a great deal of respect for Clarissa. She is she's a force of nature and pretty fearless. I didn't set off to be a foreign correspondent that covers wars and conflicts. It actually was not part of my my strategic life plan. But when the news pivots, that's part of the job. And having grown up in a military environment, it wasn't totally foreign to me. Having said that, I will it's actually not. I think journalists from all walks of life and whatever gender, it's difficult to work in a foreign country that is unstable. You do have to rely on other people, not just your own gut instinct for what's safe and what's not safe. Plenty of us, almost all of us, when we're deployed to conflict zones, is we have lots of local team members who are there working with us as drivers or as translators, as fixers, as we know them, people who can help us find safe water to drink, or find a safe place to lay our head at night. And so some of the ways you get by is just that you have an incredible group of local team members who are helping you through some of the thickest and hairiest parts of reporting in stable places. But as a woman, I find that being a woman is actually, within Islamic cultures specifically, it's almost a secret weapon. In part because if you play your cards right and you have your head screwed on straight, you can leverage. You can leverage some of the bias against you. If there is a self-important man who underestimates women, it's much easier to get him to tell you his secrets because he doesn't actually think that you're that you know what you're talking about. I also have to say that as a woman who was raised largely in the South, I have a habit. My modus operandi is to kill them with kindness. You spend a lot of time with your small talk. You praise people's hospitality. They take you in. And Arabs, no matter where they're from, love gracious hosts and love gracious guests. So, I can spend hours with people. If you're not a New York asshole trying to get someone to give you a quick hit quote, you can learn a lot about someone. And that's probably my secret from the field.
Interesting. A question from my friend Eric Larson. Do you think U.S. law enforcement organizations working domestically have learned, as you have, from presumably different intelligence organizations who fostered intelligence allies in Iraq?
Yes, I think it was a steep learning curve, and it's taken much too long for those lessons to be learned. But yes, in fact, I document some of that in my book, and part of that is the U.S. putting certain individuals in very powerful positions in the Iraqi intelligence and intelligence agencies and armed forces, and then realizing they couldn't trust them. And it took way too many years and way too many deaths. But yes, lessons are being learned. There's also now, I think, in this forever war, it'd be almost impossible for the U.S. not to do things better than they were doing in 2003. But I can say, simply from interacting, as I mentioned during my presentation, interacting between some of the Iraqi intelligence officials and FBI counterintelligence teams in Washington 2 summers ago, there was a lot of openness to seeing what success looked like in other places.
Yeah. And one question that comes from one of our board members, Chip O'Brien, and the question is, can you tell us a little bit about your new career at The Current, please?
Oh, thank you. That's a great softball question. I love it. Yeah. So Chip, I came. I came back to Savannah. My husband and I have had our house here for over a decade, and there was an intention of making Savannah our full-time home, but then there was also this gap of my husband's also a journalist, by the way, how do two ambitious journalists make coastal Georgia and Savannah their full-time home when this has not been a region known for ambitious journalism for quite a long time. With due respect to any of my journalist colleagues on the call or in town, there's been an immense amount of experience and talent and goodwill trying to fight the good fight to keep journalism alive here. But when the Savannah Morning News gets bought up by an outside corporation and then another outside corporation who those owners don't care about Savannah, and they certainly don't care about anything other than their shareholders and their bottom line, local news suffers. So I got my book contract. I left my steady newsroom job behind, and I came home to Savannah to write the book in 2019. I got deeper into conversations with my friends and sort of wider social networks, and realized that it wasn't just me who wanted to know more about what was going on in our fair city and down the coastline. I love football as much as another person, but I think that there's deeper subjects to tackle other than high school football scores. And so there was a group of concerned community leaders, business people, and they decided that they would pitch in some seed money and set up some operating revenue. And I said, I will stick around in Savannah and try to launch a news organization in a time of COVID. Another one of your board members, the incredible Susan Catron, is my partner in this adventure. And we have a third spoke of our wheel, a man named Bert Roughton, who is the retired managing editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He has retired and lives in St. Simons. He and I were old colleagues and buddies 20 years ago in my AJC, Cox Newspapers days. And so, together we've put together and launched a digital news organization, and we're trying to tackle big, meaty subjects, whether it is government accountability or education or health or public safety. We're building momentum. We're gaining staff, and hopefully we're going to improve all lives for all of us here in Savannah, and way down to Brunswick and St. Mary's too.
It's going to be very interesting. Another interesting slice of our life here, and something that'll strengthen our fabric of society here. So we wish you the best of luck on that one.
Thank you.
I have a question from our one of our board members, our president, who says, Jose de Cruz, he says, Sun Tzu's admonition to know yourself and know thy enemy, do solely with the enemy in mind, he says, but also the history of insurgency and counterinsurgency has been one of lessons learned and lessons lost. Could you give us a few examples where DHS, Department of Homeland Security, or the FBI is actually applying what they learned from the Falcons? Is that possible? We're all highly rated here, and
yeah.
It's a classified briefing, right?
Well, here's the thing, I think professional intelligence officers will tell you, no matter what country you're in, you never get credit for the things you do well. You only get blamed for the one thing that goes wrong. And of course, the things that go wrong are deadly and traumatic. And so, we still actually, my colleagues who write the first draft of history, my former journalism colleagues from the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they're all still scrambling to figure out who knew what when, right? Ahead of January 6th. And that is, there's a lot of questions to be answered, just like after 9/11. It took the 9/11 Commission, I think, 4 or 5 years to come out with their final report about who knew what when, and all the signals and bits of information that were gathered in these discrete locations and nobody was sharing. And so interagency relationships were supposed to have been changed as a result of that. That when you've got all the breadcrumbs, but nobody actually can see where the trail ends. This as a domestic terror threat, groups who look like us and might have served in the military or served in law enforcement with us, that poses an incredibly deep and urgent threat. And how to get to the bottom of that is something that we as a nation are going to have to tackle pretty, in a pretty deep and concerted ways. The Department of Homeland Security, there's and the FBI, there's a whole lot of concern and debate among, again, people who are in counterintelligence and counterterrorism. They have been able to see the threat of white supremacy and white domestic terror groups of people who are white and Christian as opposed to Muslim. They've seen this on the rise for years and years. But resources, again, the huge battleship that is the U.S. Department of U.S. government. It's very hard to switch gears and turn that ship around when so many resources have been put into Islamic extremism for so long. There has been a lot of interagency I think, bureaucratic battles about trying to refashion those resources to the clear and present danger, which has changed over the last 15 years. So, in the ongoing fights, the war on drugs, the ongoing fights about gang warfare, the ongoing fights about domestic extremism, all those, there probably are a lot of resources to tackle it all, but they've been geared to one decreasing threat, and that's been Islamic extremism. So it's not a very good answer to your question, but I think that as sort of a, if you forgive the colloquialism, a come to Jesus moment, I think that Department of Homeland Security and the rest of the federal agencies, different agencies who tackle armed domestic threats, they're going to have to come to Jesus now and retool their bureaucracies and their resources in order to effectively fight what we now see as a threat on the rise.
So is your, a personal question, are you optimistic, knowing what you know and the direction that the super tanker is going, where the resources have been funneled, how we're organized, what the challenge is, and I'm talking about the domestic terrorism. Are you optimistic?
In the short term, no, not really. When America, but I'm an eternal optimist about America. Our great experiment in democracy has thrived for so long because we are a nation that can reinvent and revive ourselves. No matter what the economic or security threat that has been posed to us. But in those great challenges, also, we've been able to handle them through the 19th and 20th century because we've also had great leadership, and we've been able to, as a nation, coalesce around the nature of a threat. Right. And in right now, our political leadership is divided about what the definition of a threat looks like, and even what the definition of a fact looks like. So that fills me with a lot of anxiety, but I'm forever optimistic. I think the death knell of America has been prematurely rung. I think that we definitely have a long history ahead of us, and I also believe, having studied economics as well as international relations, that economic stability is also, an unsung tactic, an unappreciated tactic in terms of being able to right this battleship and get us going back to the right direction.
So I've got a couple more questions, and I'm going to do something that we generally try not to do, and that's go beyond 8 o'clock. But one of them, go back to Becky Cheatham, who is one of our board members, has a question, and she has not submitted it, but I understand she has a question. Becky, can you unmute and ask that question, please? Because I have not received it. Okay, while you're trying, let me ask, and this is from Chip O'Brien. Can you answer this? Are journalists abroad often a cover for spying?
No, actually, no. It's something that I've been asked in many occasions when I have been interviewing, senior members of Hezbollah, for example, or Iranian Revolutionary Guards, or even right-wing Israelis. I think that through history books that I've read, there were definitely times in early 20th century that the CIA, with its narrow funnel of recruiting, would take some of the best and brightest as journalists and from the Ivy Leagues to be either formal or informal spies for them. But gosh, no. There's no way that a journalist in today's world would. If you're taking your job seriously, there's no way that you would compromise yourself like that. In part because it puts you in danger. It puts you in danger when you're trying to work overseas. But there's a very complicated choreography among national security reporters. The Washington game of access and the Washington bureaucratic game of leaking. You've got to try to establish good relationships with sources, and you have to figure out whether you can trust them or not. The inside the beltway, whether you are a lobbyist or a bureaucrat, a lawmaker or a journalist, there's lots. The lines are fuzzier now than they used to be about. In the last 20 years, about who it's appropriate to go out to dinner with, who is appropriate to marry. There's a lot of mixed couples within, someone from the Pentagon and someone who works at NBC or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. But generally, newsrooms also, at least quality old-fashioned newsrooms, have these firewalls in place. That if you have a relationship, either personal, your brother works at the Pentagon, or your husband works at the Pentagon, you won't be able to cover national security or the military, because it appears to be a conflict of interest, even if it wouldn't be. So from the journalistic ethical background, no, you would never ever work for both sides.
Sorry to disappoint you, Chip. There you go.
Well, Hollywood probably gets that wrong a lot, but in the real world, no.
Last question from Ann Fenstermacher, who was our first ask. And her question is, how do you determine, and this goes to your new venture, how do you determine what topics that you'll take on and pursue?
Well, we have big ambitions and a small staff. And so there is a very, very pedestrian answer to that, which is so many questions, so few talented, qualified people to be reporters to cover them. We have to kind of take them off one by one. And sometimes it's a strategic decision, and sometimes it's just very, very basic. Is there someone free that can do that? If not, we put it on the back burner and come back to it after a couple of months. So, but in terms of our, that's sort of your daily newsroom decisions. But in terms of our strategic thinking, we are looking at big strategic, in-depth projects that we can take on, because that's the kind of journalism that's not being done here anymore. And so right now, we have 2 investigations ongoing, and both of them are actually focused in Brunswick and Glenn County. We are looking for a talented reporter to join us this summer, so we can take on another in-depth project here in our backyard in Savannah and Chatham County too.
Good luck. Well, so thank you, Ms. Margaret Coker. This will include our program this evening, but thank you so much for an excellent presentation, as well as very interesting and thoughtful answers to our questions. We're grateful to you for your contributions to our program, and an important effort necessary that on a topic that is so important to maintaining the fabric of civil society. We wish you all the best in your new venture at the Current, and look forward to seeing you around town, as well as following you in your venture.
Thank you. I'd be pleased to talk more. I live very close to Forsyth, so anyone wants to grab a coffee, you can find me at Collins Corners most mornings.
Oh yeah, great. We know where that is. So yeah. I'd like to add a word about our in addition to our spring program before we lose anybody. Please mark your calendars for a special in-person talk entitled "Britain After Brexit: Priorities and Opportunities in Foreign Policy and Trade." It'll be presented by the United Kingdom's General Counsel, Andrew Staunton. It'll be presented to Savannah Council and Learning Center members on Tuesday afternoon, June 15th, 5:30 p.m. Again, it'll be in person at the Learning Center on Bull Street. Details to follow shortly. And with that, I wish you all a good luck. Thank you again, Margaret. And thank you all for joining us for Margaret Coker's presentation on Spies and Allies, how lessons from the war on terrorism can influence the fight against extremism at home. See you all in June. Thank you.
Thank you.